Hello, everyone, and thank you for being here today. My name is Alvaro Llobet. I'm the head of product here at Finboot, and today, with me, we have a very special guest. Geoffrey Cann has been an advisor for Finboot for the last 5 years. Thank you, Geoffrey. How are you?
It's a pleasure to be here all the way from Vancouver and visiting Barcelona.
It's great. We were discussing before. I think I met you like 6 or 7 years ago.
2019, 2020. I can't remember the exact timing, but before the pandemic, certainly.
It's amazing how time flies, to be honest. Do you want to give a little bit of an introduction?
Sure. So I'm an author, international author, and professional speaker and trainer on digital innovation in the context of the broader energy industry. I spent a first career with a big oil company to learn the industry from that side. Then I joined Deloitte and stayed there almost 29 years as working my way up through the consulting business around the world with tours in Hong Kong and Australia. I've worked in 29, 30 countries around the world. Then I left Deloitte 5 years ago and began writing books and speaking about what I saw as the critical mission of the energy industry, which was to embrace digital innovation, much like how other industries have, for the purposes of helping the industry decarbonize itself quickly, become much more efficient and cost-effective and lower carbon. My hypothesis is that whether we like it or not, we're all going to have to live with fossil fuels for a long time as we work to decarbonize our economies. Digital innovations offer a pathway for us to improve the performance of that industry while we figure out decarbonization challenges. And which is why I became so fascinated with Finboot. When I first met with Finboot years ago, I immediately thought this is a company poised to disrupt the sector of trusted data, trusted ledgers. And I thought that the possibilities for Finboot's success were nearly endless because we literally have energy products we cannot trust. And so if we can, using some of the tools from Finboot, transform that part of the energy sector, it creates a pathway for all of us to sustain the lifestyles we have while we decarbonize.
And I think you have an incredible knowledge because what we usually see, the oil, the energy industry, the chemical industry, when we see them, all of them are usually not very digitalized, no? And back in when you were starting to look at this topic, it was less than today, no? And we can see that digital is shifting now, not only the company itself, but is driving it into sustainability. So there's kind of a very interesting mix of topics there. Now we have also a lot of regulations, and we are going to speak about that today, because I think that has been the perfect combination to bring up to speed companies into sustainability. Digital is the key for that.
Yeah, I totally agree. People need to appreciate the energy industry as we know it globally, specifically oil and gas, but also power, has been an industrial part of our landscape for 100 years or more. And that much of the landscape in oil and gas in particular predates the internet era.
Of course.
So the idea that we can somehow take this industry and make it sing digital, become digitalized very quickly is just folly. It just cannot happen because the industry itself was never set up for this.
Of course.
So it's going to take time, and but at the same time, these industries exist in a capital markets construct where the investors who invest money into the industry, the investors expect certain returns and certain performance, and unless they see that, they will withdraw their investment. Well, none of us really want that because we need the products. So we have a capital markets which is influencing the industry to behave in a certain fashion, which also tends to depress their interest in investing in things which, from the outside, you would say would be a definite improvement, but from their vantage point actually is a detraction. And this is what gives rise to this funny combination we see, which is incentives to behave in a certain way, as well as rules to behave in a certain way. And we're at this interesting place now globally where we have this interplay between incentives on the one hand and rules on the other hand to try and create the context for industrial change that we all would value.
Like looking at the energy industry in the US, in Canada, but also worldwide, I would say that over the last years, there has been a shift into sustainability. No, we are seeing that from a political standpoint. We are seeing new regulations. We are seeing incentives. We will speak about that later. But how do you see, on one side, how prepared are these industries to adapt into these new changes, and also how do you see them approaching it day to day?
Well, for the most part, they're not well prepared to deal with the sustainability business model challenges that they're confronting. And the reason for that is, again, back to their history. These industries were never set up to perform in the manner that sustainability rules would require them to do. And just to use a very simple example, your car, my car, we should be able to take that vehicle to any gasoline station and buy gasoline and know that it will work in our car. But we have no idea where that gasoline came from. And it could have come from the Middle East, could have come from the United States, could have come from Russia. Because we don't know where it came from, the industry has set itself up in such a fashion that it doesn't need to trace where it came from. And the reason for that is that we need the ability to take, say, fuel from one country and blend it with the fuel from another country. Now you have this blended product. Well, part of it might be from one part of the industry and part might be from another part of the industry. We might say in the food industry, you need to be able to track where those different inputs came from. But that was never part of the industrial landscape for the energy industry ever. And now we're seeking to impose it on the industry. That's just this one simple example. Blending is what creates this incredible difficulty for the industry to try and cope with dealing with these sustainability rules.
And I think that is also a very complex process to track because we have many different intermediates. So it's a very complex supply chain process, no?
It's very complicated, and because of the fact that petroleum products, gasoline, diesel, jet fuel, they're used in virtually every country of the world. They're used in virtually every location within those countries. I mean, can you name a country that does not use an internal combustion engine anywhere? It's not possible. So it's used everywhere. And because of the product itself is a dangerous, toxic, flammable, explosive, asphyxiant, it's a very dangerous product. It's under tight control physically as it moves through an economy. And it requires a lot of careful infrastructure to maintain the safety over that product. And that turns into things like tanks, underground and above ground tanks, pipeline systems, trucks to move the product around, rail cars to shift it back and forth, ships to move it around the between countries. Each of these creates a tracking and tracing problem. Like, where did this product actually come from? And as I say, it's used everywhere in every imaginable context. I mean, you can't build anything without diesel fuel because that's how we do lifting things. We use diesel fuel, tractors and the like. You can't grow food. Farmers use diesel fuel in their farming equipment. You can't process food. We use gas to heat to cook the raw material to make food. You can't go to the hospital because ambulances need gasoline to get. So we use it everywhere through the economy.
So at the end, is a foundation sector. Totally. For us.
Completely foundational. And to transform it from one model to another overnight is just folly.
It's very complex. And then if we want to add a level of complexity into this already complex market, we have new fuels. So we have new products that have been introduced because this specific sustainability purposes, no?
Exactly, yeah.
So then I want to touch into one specific regulation that is EUDR, no? So for giving a little bit of context to everyone, EUDR is a regulation that is being applied here in the European Union.
Yes.
That what it's going to do is try and regulate deforested origins of raw materials, no? This, for very easy understanding, applies to palm oil, applies to soy, applies to wood. So we can imagine that many different new fuels that are made with this type of raw materials, at the end organic raw materials, materials that come from land, are going to be applied this regulation, no? So I want to ask you, how are you seeing that this regulation, in fact, that is in Europe, is affecting many different companies, energy companies worldwide?
Well, the regulation, its intent, of course, is to make sure that countries that have forests, which are carbon sinks today, are not deforested and in turn planted with food crops or that are in turn turned into fuel crops. A good example would be corn and sugarcane. You take the forest down, put in sugarcane, turn the sugarcane into ethanol, and then sell ethanol as a fuel. The EUDR's its intent is to make sure that this behavior internationally is minimized. And it's not just aimed at fuel, it's aimed at food products, furniture, leather, cattle, all kinds of different products which are contributing to deforestation, which in turn contributes to our climate challenges. So the EUDR's its intent from a fuel standpoint is not entirely clear because it doesn't name fuel energy products specifically in the regulations. But it is not a far stretch at all to go from a European regulation that, say, requires aircraft to use sustainable aviation fuel to a deforestation regulation where a country, Indonesia, Malaysia, someplace with ample forest, Brazil, starts taking down their forests to create food crops to turn it into sustainable aviation fuel. This would be completely counter to how the EUDR is intended to behave. So although it today does not name energy as a specific problem, you can see how the regulation will be applied in that instance, because we've also created the rule to get ourselves to much higher levels of biodiesel, bioenergy products, sustainable aviation fuel.
Yeah, and we are seeing also that, for example, with other regulations as CBAM. No? So what we are seeing is that the European Union is not much focusing only on companies and products inside the European Union, but also when production is moved outside, when we have products that are coming at the end to the European Union, and at the end, these companies that operate with the European Union will need to comply, no? So
yeah, it's the interplay of these two rules, which is, if you're not familiar with CBAM and how it works, its purpose is to apply a carbon price on inbound products from outside of the EU, which are very carbon intense. Cement and steel as an example. So in the EU, a carbon price will be charged for cement manufacturing, and CBAM is intended to make sure that the same carbon price is applied to that same product, even though it's come from, say, another country like China or the United States. So its purpose is to, quote, level the playing field, make sure that the products compete on a level basis. And behind that, of course, is to make sure that steel manufacturing or cement manufacturing does not move from Europe to a place with lower carbon pricing so that it then can be sold back into the EU at a cheaper price. Its purpose is to make sure that does not happen. So it's in part carbon pricing, it's in part industrial regulatory, it's in part industrial policy to make sure that industries don't flee the EU because of these rules. It's to make sure that there's no advantage to, say, shifting your production elsewhere. So as you can see, it's the interplay of these two rules that create the context where energy products may themselves fall under EUDR regulations and become something that the industry must deal with, must track. So for a North American company, say, that feels that there may be an opportunity to produce ethanol and sell that into European markets, even though the United States or Canada have not been deforested in a very long time, that land was deforested for farming 200 years ago. That ethanol will still need to comply with the EUDR, which means that they will need to prove that the product came from a place that did not benefit from deforestation policies by that particular location.
And I think that one very interesting topic related to these regulations is how they can be applied and why they are being applied now with digital technologies. No, so for example, in EUDR, I would say that without the technology that we have today, this regulation couldn't exist, because you are asking, just to give also a little bit of context, you're asking any company that is importing goods into the European Union to check with a satellite that land specifically of the origin of that raw material is not deforested.
Exactly.
And then there's a very complex European Union system that you need to integrate, and there's a lot of back and forth of at the end information. So imagine you have a raw material, a real product that is coming from, as you said, maybe Indonesia. We are moving it through a trader into the European Union, and then it's coming into a facility to be converted into another product. And you need to, on this process, also check with that location system. how do you see these companies that at the end, and we have discussed, they are not so much digitalized.
Yeah.
How do you see them changing all their systems into this complex ecosystem? No.
Well, it's extremely challenging to do this, and as you can see, as you extend it through the entire supply chain, you can imagine as an example. Let's take an automotive manufacturer, European automotive manufacturer, of which there's some tremendously successful companies: BMW, Mercedes, Volvo. These companies have leather seats. Our cars have leather seats. Well, where did that leather come from? Right? Where is that from? Well, the EUDR, that came from cattle, because that's typically where, unless it's ostrich fur, a leather, some sort of specialized leather, but generally speaking, is cattle. Well, that cattle falls under the EUDR. Did you deforest the land so that you could raise cattle, which you in turn use the leather to feed into automobiles? Was the fuel you used to deforest the land, or was the fuel you used to create your product, say in another country, was it used to enable you to sell a product into Europe at a more advantageous price? That's what the regulations are trying to mitigate, to make sure that doesn't happen. It's hard to see how small companies, say in Indonesia or Brazil or even Canada, the United States, other suppliers into Europe, it's hard to see how they could possibly be prepared to cope with regulations like this. It's not something that they would have ever had to do. We've always, industrially, we've maintained typically arm's length relationship between companies in a supply chain so that you don't actually have to be that close to each other's business practices. The EUDR is forcing companies now to be much more transparent with each other about what they're up to and how they manufacture product. So in terms of preparation and readiness, very low, very low. It's just not logical to assume that they're highly, highly prepared.
Yeah, and when we start to see, as you were mentioning, the high level of the regulation, we start to see the raw materials. That's great. But as you said, this goes really deep into the current process of the farmers, of the supply chain, import and export process, into the production. So at the end, this has a really deep connection into the company's processes. So
it's very deep. And for that to work, given that we have in our supply chains at the top end, say a huge industrial manufacturing concern, very sophisticated, world class. You think of European automakers, all the way down to mom and pop farmers, like subsistence farming. Yeah. And everyone in that supply chain is now going to be expected to be transparent about how their business operations play, so that the top company, the European automaker, can guarantee that their product throughout the whole supply chain has not violated EUDR regulations at any level. Very demanding question.
Exactly. And as you mentioned before, here at Finboot, what we try to do at the end is bring those facilities, how they can do this process, comply into EU at the end in the easiest way possible, yeah. On a very complex process.
It's very complex. It's all about data, as you know. So for a local farmer who's raising cattle that he then she then sells into the food industry for the purposes of beef or leather manufacturing, they need to produce and be able to provide data to prove what it is that they've been their business and how it's been performing to satisfy these rules. And so how do you do that? How do you collect that data? And so we need very, very simple, easy to use tools, which at the same time are also highly trusted, transparent, very impossible to corrupt or very challenging to corrupt, that are globally accessible from the top of the industrial chain all the way down to the bottom, by individuals who are just doing their very best to run a straightforward business. This is it's a huge opportunity, but it's one of the reasons why, again, back to why I was attracted to Finboot in the first instance, was there is no other way to do this other than to use these clever, trusted ledgers, which are accessible internationally.
Definitely. And I think that one of the main objectives that we have is try not to disrupt the current operations, with, at the end, the objective of being sustainable. Because one of the problems that we have is that when we want to apply sustainable practices, we need to change company processes, we need to change systems. And at the end, as we said, that has a big disruption. No? Our objective is to try and adapt into their processes to be able to comply with sustainability at the end easily. No, the easiest way we have. Changing a little bit of the topic, you are really well familiar with regulations in the US and Canada, no?
I live there, so I'm a little more exposed to those than the European regulations. But energy is a global industry, so you have to watch what happens globally.
In the IRA, there's incentive for companies to be more sustainable, no?
Yes.
That is a little bit of an opposite strategy into the European Union of being more forcing companies to be sustainable and having penalties. In EUDR, that penalty can be even a 4% of your turnover. So that is really, really high. That's scary for companies not to comply, to be honest. How do you see that different strategies of, at the end, different politics, no, applied on sustainability for companies? How do you see that?
Well, in my mind, it comes back to the geopolitical context which is what creates the different kind of regulatory versus incentive structures. In the United States, each state is able to impose its own rules for local activity. It's one of the structures of the United States. So, in order for the United States to say have a global rule, it's very, very challenging. Very challenging. But what's easier for the United States to do is to create a taxation incentive structure at the federal level, because all companies in the United States have to pay a federal tax. So if you can create the right set of changes necessary in the industrial context in the United States, it is way easier to do it through tax policy than it is to try and enact rules at each of 50 states. The United States, I like to joke, America's favorite sport is litigation.
That's a good one.
It's not tennis.
No.
It's not baseball. It's litigation. So even if you put rules in place, the American context creates incentives for people to sue each other and litigate and test the validity of laws in court systems, which can take a very, very long time. So if you want to do things quickly in the United States, and let's admit climate pressures are forcing countries to react quite quickly, it is way faster to do it through the tax system in the United States than it is through regulation. Europe is different. Europe is very challenging to change the taxation rules in each country, but it is very easy to establish rules that apply across the full European context. That's the whole point of the European experiment, is to create a level playing field across nations. So it's easier to do rule sets in Europe, and so this is why you look at the carrot versus stick model, the carrot in the United States versus the stick in Europe. That's, I think, is the root cause as to why the countries, the two blocks, U.S. As an economy and EU as a trading bloc, why they behave in that different fashion. And it remains to be seen which one is better or faster. But the context in the North America is very definitely financial incentive to behave in the right way, because the challenge of putting the rules in place to create the right behavior is so much more difficult.
I think that this will give us into the future a perspective of how those, at the end, different types of policies and different incentives are going to make companies shift between one place or another. At the end, this is going to give companies, I think, the idea of where to locate different assets and where to produce and when to import and how to import. And like this will give two different things. Now, by one side, how the companies are going to evolve in different markets, of course, and how they're going to position themselves on those different markets. No, and I think that it's going to be very interesting looking at this in the future to see how different policies and different strategies work. No?
Yeah, it's you can already see examples of it. It's been in the media reported that at least a couple of large European energy companies have stated their dissatisfaction with the increasing regulatory load that they face in Europe, of course, versus the attractiveness of the high liquidity capital markets in the United States, the lower regulatory pressures certainly at the federal level, and the incentive created by the Inflation Reduction Act is having this effect of encouraging industrial concerns in Europe to speculate openly and publicly about moving their operations more into the United States to take advantage of this. And so, yes, we don't really fully understand how this is going to play out, but it's already in the public eye that these two pressures, incentive on the one side, regulation on the other, is forcing companies to have to reconcile how they structure their industrial enterprise so that they optimize appropriately.
Definitely. So it was a pleasure having you here. I think that covered all of my questions. Do you have anything you want to ask me or any other message you want to give to our audience today?
One thing, observation I would make is that what happens in Europe matters. The European market is I like to think of it as a gilt-edged market, which means extremely attractive market. Wealthy people, sophisticated economies, high standard of livings. This is a very attractive global market. And what happens here matters globally. And it's increasingly obvious that European regulators, as sophisticated as they are, do set the bar for other regulators around the world. Like other regulators watch Europe to see, well, what are the Europeans doing? That's the highest bar. So if you can get to the European standard of performance, you're virtually guaranteed to get to the standard of performance of virtually any other economy.
Of course.
So companies that are able to compete successfully in Europe can compete successfully anywhere in the world. And I think that's really important. So don't dismiss the European market. It actually becomes the bar for everywhere. And so that would be my closing thought on the ideas is to keep an eye on Europe. What happens here really matters.
So thank you, Geoffrey, for being here. It was a pleasure having you in Barcelona. I hope we can see each other again very soon.
Thank you so much. It's been my pleasure to be here.